Welcome, I'm Jordan, and this is The Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today we're going to be talking about Calvinism, specifically some objections to it. And my guest is someone that works in a closely related field on the topic of free will. And my guest is Dr. Justin Capes. He is a professor of philosophy at Flagler College. Thank you for coming on, Dr. Capes.
Thank you for having me.
From looking at your published work, you write a whole lot about free will.
Yeah, so most of my scholarly research is focused on questions in moral philosophy about the nature of human agency, and in particular questions about free will and moral responsibility. So I'm sort of interested in what are the conditions that are required for us to be morally responsible for our behavior, and obviously free will is a big part of that.
Free will comes up in theological discussions, usually when soteriology comes into play, and Calvinism is going to be one of these views that has something to say about both God's providence in the world, but also man's freedom. So I thought it would be good to have you on.
Yeah, great. If I can tell a quick story, it was actually a Calvinism that got me thinking about philosophy in the first place.
Oh, wow.
I remember as a young child growing up in church, I remember a particular Sunday school class when I was about 10 years old. And I made some comment in the class, and the pastor of the church happened to hear the comment. I can't remember if he was sitting in the class or if he was walking by. And he said, "No, that's not right. We don't choose God. God chooses us. God decides who's going to go to heaven and who's going to go to hell." And I remember being very troubled by that, because I was just a little kid, and here's the pastor, and he knows these theological issues. So I felt the pressure of authority to agree with him. But on the other hand, I kept thinking to myself, that can't be right. If God chooses, then it's not fair. And that's the sort of first philosophical sort of conundrum I remember confronting.
Yeah, that's
so
interesting.
maybe that goes into some explanation about why I got to working on these things in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so we've mentioned the term a few times, Calvinism. How would you define Calvinism?
Yeah, good. So the term Calvinism is used to refer to a variety of theological doctrines associated with the 16th century Protestant reformer John Calvin. However, at least in Protestant circles, the term is often used a bit more narrowly to refer to a set of soteriological doctrines held by Calvin and many other reformers and Christian theologians as well. And the chief one is this idea that although everything, including the eternal destinies of every person that ever has lived or will live, is predetermined by God before the creation of the world, still, nevertheless, human creatures have free will and are justly punished for their sinful actions. So that's the basic idea. And I think this view is captured pretty well in some passages from the Westminster Confession, right? So I'm just going to read them. So in section 3.1 of the confession, it says that God from all eternity did by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Yet so is thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of creatures. And then later on in section 3, it says, by the decree of God for the manifestations of his glory, some men and angels are predestined unto everlasting life, and others are foreordained to everlasting death. So I think those quotes capture sort of pretty well these central soteriological doctrines. And so I think if I were to sum it up, I would say that Calvinism, or at least, right, this subset of Calvinism that focuses on soteriology or the doctrine of salvation boils down to three main claims. So the first claim is theological determinism. And so this is the idea that everything that happens in the universe, including human sinful behavior, was determined by God before the foundation of the world. So before God did anything, before we did anything, before anything was created, God said, this is how it's going to be. And he set it up to ensure that it would be that way. So that's theological determinism. The second main sort of component of Calvinism is what philosophers would recognize as the doctrine of compatibilism. So compatibilism says that free will and moral responsibility are compatible with our actions being wholly and fully determined by factors beyond our control, such as the divine will of God or something like that. So the thought here is that even if theological determinism is true, that doesn't rule out our having free will or deserving praise or blame or punishment or reward for our behavior. So that would compatibilism. That would be the second aspect of Calvinism, and then the third aspect sort of is very similar, and it just says, and we might call this divine blame. And this is the idea that God does, in fact, blame us and punish us for our sinful behavior. And he's perfectly entitled to do so. Right? He doesn't do anything unjust or inappropriate when he blames and punishes us for our sin.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those three ideas, divine blame, compatibilism, and theological determinism, those are sort of the core tenets of what often goes by this idea of Calvinism.
Mm-hmm. Often you hear the term tulip come up. Let's see if I can remember. Total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. Okay, so that often goes under, if you ask someone what Calvinism is, they'll say it's this set of doctrines. The way you've defined it here, the three things you've mentioned, pretty much all Calvinists affirm theological determinism, compatibilism, and divine blame, like you said. So these seem to be really core. I don't know that you want to say they're the only elements, parts of Calvinism, but they seem to be essential to the account. Maybe I could say that.
Yeah, I think these are sort of the core ideas around which Calvinism. But like I suggested, right, there are wider and narrower uses of the term Calvinism. Right, sometimes you'll hear Calvinism just sort of as referred to broadly as a set of doctrines that Calvin promulgated. But like I said, usually when you hear the term, at least in Protestant circles, it's focused more narrowly on these soteriological doctrines. And yeah, I think this idea of tulip is pretty common. But you also get some debate there among Calvinists about what total depravity. So right, some interpret it as total depravity. Others say no, that's different from total inability. Right, and they'll have these sort of in-house debates. But I think that pretty much all Calvinists that I know of that would sort of self-identify as Calvinists, they hold those three theses that I mentioned.
Okay, so that's kind of the definition. So now I just wanted to move into some objections, both philosophical and theological, to Calvinism that you have, because you're not a Calvinist.
No, I'm definitely not. I've retained that childhood aversion to the idea.
Yeah, so just, I guess, start with whatever objection you'd like.
Yeah. So why don't we just go in order of the three ideas, so we can start with theological determinism. So remember, theological determinism is this idea that everything that happens was predetermined by God. So I believe you've had people on the channel talking about theological determinism before. I think you had Peter Furlong on, and he talked
Yes.
about various reasons. But I don't think so. Some viewers who are interested in this topic might go back and look at that episode. But I may be mistaken, but I don't think this objection came up in that conversation. So I'll bring it up here. So this objection to theological determinism actually comes from a friend of mine, Josh Rasmussen, who teaches at Azusa Pacific. And Josh isn't dealing directly with theological determinism, but I do think his argument is relevant to that. So I thought it would be a good thing to discuss here. So and for viewers who are interested, the paper is called "On the Value of Freedom to Do Evil," and it's published in Faith and Philosophy. So if anyone's interested in the paper, I highly recommend that you read it. But Josh asks us to consider two examples. So I'm just going to read off the examples for us. So this first one we can call forced love. And in it, Sally loves daffodils, and her husband, Sam, knows this. But rather than wait to see if Sam will decide to buy her daffodils, Sally discreetly pours a love potion into Sam's soup. After Sam eats the soup, the potion deterministically causes him to form a desire sufficiently strong so as to causally determine that Sam expresses love to Sally by surprising her with a vase full of daffodils. As a result, Sam does exactly that. All right, so that's forced love. Now let's compare that case to a case that we can call unforced love. So in unforced love, Sally loves daffodils, and her husband Sam knows this. One day, Sam decides of his own accord to express love to Sally by surprising her with a vase full of daffodils. All right, so when we compare these two cases, we might ask the following question. Which case seems better? Right? Which seems better? Is forced love better, or is unforced love better? And the answer seems pretty obvious, right? It seems that unforced love is better. Now, I think we have to be careful here. I'm not claiming that forced love isn't really love. I'm not claiming that forced love is entirely bad. It just seems that unforced love is better than forced love. And I think, we can generalize. It seems like it's better if we express love of our own accord than if we're made to do so by another, right? It doesn't seem any better. I mean, we can imagine a third case. Imagine that Sally likes daffodils, right? And so you're not sure whether Sam's going to buy her the flowers. So you pour the love potion in his thing, right? Still, it seems that unforced love is even better. And especially, it's better when, you're the one who does it than when the one who's being loved forces you to love them, right? That seems even less good. Even if it's still good, it's less good. So this highlights a reason why God might not want to determine everything we do. Because if he determines everything that we do, then those who ultimately come to love God do so by force. Now, it's not force in the sense of forcing us against our will to love God. No, it forces us in accordance with our wills to love God, right? God sets our wills towards him. But notice in unforced love, Sally doesn't force her husband to do it against his will. No, she creates the very will by giving him the love potion. So this isn't forced against our will. Still, there's a sense in which God on theological determinism makes those who love him to love him. And it seems better if we did so of our own accord. And so that's a reason why God wouldn't determine everything we do, and in particular, why he wouldn't determine us to love him. Now, if you have questions, I'd love to hear them. But before that, I just want to make this one qualification. I don't think this is a decisive argument against theological determinism, right? Because what I think it shows is that there is a reason that God might have for not determining us. It's because, right, unforced love is better than forced love. And a holy, good God might want a world full of unforced love, both creatures loving each other without him forcing us to do so, and also creatures loving God without him forcing us to love us. Seems like a good God might very well want that, but he couldn't do that if theological determinism were true. So that's a reason, but it's not to say that it's a decisive reason, right? There might be countervailing reasons that God has for determining our every choice. And those reasons might override these reasons. So it's certainly not a decisive reason, but it does sort of make intelligible, I think, why a God who could determine everything that happens, right, might elect not to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a reason for us to at least, look askance at theological determinism.
I suppose I could be wrong. Maybe somebody would think, I don't see why it's better. I mean, if it's in accord with her will, my intuitions are both are just equally good. They're of her own will, but something like that. Maybe that, I don't know. Is there
Yeah,
anything
I
to that?
mean, I I do. I mean, if for at least for those who are in relationships, especially long-term committed relationships with people you care about, um, you want them to notice the things you like, and sometimes you want them to do things for you unbidden by you, right? It's nice when we come home and the house is clean, right? And we didn't have to ask our significant other. It's nice when our significant other volunteers to take the kids out so that we can have some time for ourselves, right? Or, buys us a present that, they know we'd like without having to drop 10,000 hints, or without having to tell us to do that. I mean, we appreciate that because it shows that, we recognize this other person and we recognize their value. Um, and so I think this is a very familiar thing. It's again, it's not to say that forced love is a bad thing. It's just to say that it seems much more valuable to have our significant other love us, right, and in a way that we appreciate being loved, without us having to nudge them, right? But notice on theological determinism, it's not even that God just nudges us, right? I think a lot of theological perspectives would say God nudges us, but I mean, he sort of ensures that we love him, right? He
Mhm.
really does drop that love potion into the umbilical cord, right? At least for the elect, right? At least for those who do love him, he drops that love potion in. But wouldn't it be nice, and why couldn't we sort of see that God is worthy of love and adoration on our own, and freely choose to do that without being made to do so by God? That just seems like that would be even better. So it's not to say that on determinism our love for God is bad. It
Mhm.
might still be a very good thing. It's just to say it's better, right? If we're not made to love God, if
Mhm.
we have sort of some say in the matter.
You didn't tell these to me in advance, so I'm just thinking on the fly here. One other thought, and then we can move on to your second objection. I imagine a Calvinist might say this. Yes, it would be better. But given our total depravity, that we won't freely love God. We're completely unable to do that. So if we're gonna love God, it's because he has to act on us first. He's got to drop the potion, something like that. So it's acknowledging, yes, it might very well be better.
That's a really interesting objection, and it highlights why total depravity is often an important sort of part. Um, I think maybe one thing to say in response is, well, look, on theological determinism, which remember is part of Calvinism, God has determined that we're totally depraved. So it certainly seems like God could have created us so that we did have the ability to respond to Him of our own accord, right? Um, I don't see any reason why God couldn't have arranged it so that we do have the capability to respond of our own accord. And
Yeah,
so
that's an interesting reply to that.
let's do that.
Okay. How about the second part, or the second kind of core tenet, compatibilism? Do you have an
Okay.
objection to compatibilism?
Oh yeah, I've got tons of objections to compatibilism, but let's just stick to one. Um, okay, this one I think is a little bit more involved than any of the others. So I'll try to break it down step by step. So here's the first step of the argument. If God is already predetermined before the foundation of the world that a certain person will commit a certain sin, let's say he predetermined that Judas would betray Christ, right? If God is already predetermined before the foundation of the world, before Judas was ever born, that Judas would betray Jesus, then it seems like it's settled in advance that Judas would betray Jesus. Okay, so why do I say that? Well, it's because of the nature of God's predestination, right? If God predestines something to happen, then nothing can thwart that plan, right? God is omnipotent and he ensures that that plan comes to fruition. So if God's predetermined it, then it's settled. If it wasn't settled, right? If it was still open, unsettled, whether Judas would betray Jesus, then something could happen, right? That would thwart God's plan. But that's impossible, right? If God determines some aspect of his plan, then nothing can thwart that. So it seems that if God has already predetermined before Judas was ever born that Judas would betray Christ, then it has to be settled in advance that he would betray Christ. Okay, so that's the first step of the argument.
Okay.
We good so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
I may raise objections at the end, but let's go with that so far.
Yeah. All right. So here's the second step. If it's settled in advance by circumstances beyond Judas's control, such as God's will, that he would betray Christ, then it seems like it's not up to Judas whether he betrays Christ. And this seems to follow from a more general principle, right? If something is already settled in advance by factors outside of my control, then it seems it's not up to me, right, whether that thing happens, right? So if I go over to some friend's house and they've already settled on pizza and it's really settled that we're going to have pizza for dinner, then it seems like it's not up to me what we have for dinner, right? So similarly, if it's already been settled by factors beyond his control that Judas would betray Christ, then it seems like it's not really up to Judas whether he betrays Christ. All right, so that's the second
That's
step.
the second step.
Yeah.
Okay, I do have an objection, but I'm not going to raise it yet.
Okay.
But it's to that second step.
Okay, interesting. I can't wait to hear it. All right, so from these first two steps, it seems to follow, it does follow that if God predestines that Judas betrays Christ, then it's not up to Judas whether he betrays Christ. So that just follows from those first two premises. All right, now here's the final step of the argument. I think for someone to be morally responsible for a particular state or event, it has to be at least partly up to that person whether that state or event occurs. Right. Right. So here's an example to sort of illustrate and motivate that claim. Suppose you're walking around a beautiful park one afternoon and there's no one there, and there's this shallow pond, and you look over in the pond, right? This is a familiar example for philosophers listening. You look over in the pond and you see a really small child, and it looks like she's drowning in the pond, right? So you race over to the pond to try to rescue the child, but much to your horror, you discover that there's an impenetrable force field around the pond. Right? And there's just nothing that you can do to get in and save the child. Well, are you morally responsible? Are you, for instance, blameworthy for the death of the child in this case? It seems clearly not, right? There was just nothing you could have done to save her. It wasn't even partly up to you whether she drowned. Now, if you had had some way that you knew about to get through the force field, right? If it was partly up to you whether she drowned, then yeah, in that case, maybe you would be partly to blame for her death. But since you didn't have any way of getting through the force field, it seems like right, it's not really your fault that she drowned. So when we consider examples like this, I think they strongly motivate this idea that being morally responsible for something seems to require that that thing had been at least partly up to you, whether it happened or not. All right. So going back to Judas, if it's not even partly up to Judas whether he betrays Christ, right? Because he's been predetermined to do so, it's been settled. And if he's responsible only if it's up to him whether he betrays Christ, then it follows that he's not morally responsible and thus not blameworthy for betraying Christ. And if he's not blameworthy, then it seems like we can't be mad at him. God can't be mad at him. God can't justly punish him. So it seems like if God has predetermined Judas to betray Christ, then Judas isn't responsible. And then that, right, Judas is just one example we could use ourselves, right? That seems to generalize to say that God's determining our sin is incompatible with our being blameworthy for it.
Mm-hmm. So this isn't, though the term blame has come up in the argument, you're not attacking that third tenet yet of divine blame. You're just focusing on compatibilism and our freedom. Part of what compatibilism says is human freedom is compatible with being determined. It's compatible with determinism, right?
Right. And this argument seems to show that that's not true because it says if theological determinism is true, if God has really predetermined our sin, then it looks like we can't be blameworthy for that sin. Why? Because if God determined it, then it's not really partly up to us, right? And if it's not partly up to us, then we're not responsible for it.
Mm-hmm. And that would mean that we're not free. If it is true that we are determined, then we would not be free. And so
and really this is an argument for the incompatibility of determinism and moral responsibility, right? So I didn't use the term free will. And in general, I actually really hate the term free will because people use it in about 1,400 different ways. And so you always have to get clear about what they mean. So typically when I use it, what I mean is something like, it's partly up to you whether you behave like you do. Right. But I recognize not everyone uses the term that way. And, I'm not going to wag my finger at them and say, my way is the right way,
Yeah.
I don't think that's very productive. Yeah. So the argument didn't really use free will, but in those first two steps of the argument, right, when I talk about it being partly up to us, right, that's sort of where free will is creeping in there.
Yes. Okay. That's helpful. So I said I had a potential objection to premise 2, I think you just called it the second step in the argument.
Yeah. So premise 2.
And that objection would be Frankfurt cases. I would imagine that a Calvinist could appeal to a Frankfurt case as a counterexample to that second step. That would be a case where should I switch the examples? Let's stick with Judas. Let's say instead of God being involved in the story, a mad scientist creates a time machine, goes back in time, and puts a little microchip in Judas's head, and says, if Judas chooses to not betray Christ, then I'll activate the microchip, and that will make him go and betray Christ. But then if he doesn't choose to betray Christ, if he does choose to betray Christ, then I just won't intervene. I won't activate the microchip at all. So in that case, you can say it's settled that Judas will betray Christ. That part's settled. He will betray Christ. And it looks like, now you may come back on this part, but it looks like it's not up to Judas whether he betrays Christ or not. But nevertheless, let's say Judas chooses to betray Christ and the microchip's never activated. Well, it looks like the scientist never intervened. It looks like he did it. He's to blame for that. So I'm sorry if that wasn't clear, but hopefully that gets the idea across. What do you think about that counterexample?
Oh yeah. I've got a lot to say about that. If I can do some shameless self-promotion, I have a book coming out in December that is the whole book's on Frankfurt cases. So I like the Frankfurt cases. I think they're fun to think about, but I don't think they work. So the first thing I want to say about that objection is I don't think that's an objection to step 2 of the argument I gave. So step 2, remember, says if it's settled in advance by circumstances beyond Judas's control that he'll betray Christ, then it's not up to Judas whether he betrays Christ. So in your sort of Frankfurt style version of the story, I still think it's not up to Judas whether he betrays Christ, because either he chooses on his own to betray Christ, or he's going to choose to betray Christ as a result of the neuroscientist's microchip, right, that's been installed in his brain. But either way, he betrays Christ. And those are the only 2 options. Either he does it, right, of his own free will, right, of his own accord, or he does it because the neuroscientist forced him to do it. But either way, he does it. So it's settled that he's going to betray Christ. So it seems like it's not up to him whether he betrays Christ. But now, I do think the Frankfurt cases are an objection to step 4 of, or
okay.
I'll call it step, whatever number we're on. I'm missing the numbers, but the step of the argument that I think the Frankfurt cases challenge is this one. For a person to be morally responsible for their behavior, it has to be at least partly up to them whether they engage in that behavior, right?
Okay.
So in your Judas example, right, it looks like he's morally responsible for betraying Christ, but it's not even partly up to him whether he betrays Christ, because either he's going to do it on his own or he's going to do it as a result of the microchip, right? So he's responsible, it seems, but it's not even partly up to him whether he betrays Christ in that case, right? So if that's right, then that would refute that 4th step in the argument.
Okay.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've got a lot to say about Frankfurt cases.
Yeah.
I would imagine you would appeal to the flicker of freedom response. You might.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you elaborate on what the flicker of freedom response is to Frankfurt cases?
Yeah, and I won't go into too much detail here. I'll just sort of be really quick. So I do think we have this intuition that in your Frankfurt version of the Judas story, Judas is responsible for betraying Christ. But I think when we think more carefully about it, we actually have good reason to reject that conclusion. So what I would say is, no, Judas isn't, in fact, morally responsible for betraying Christ. And he isn't morally responsible precisely because it wasn't even partly up to him whether he betrayed Christ. But how can I say that, right? That seems so counterintuitive. Well, here's what I want to say. Judas is responsible for something in the Frankfurt version of the story. And what he's responsible for is choosing on his own to betray Christ, right? Choosing without being forced by the neuroscientist to betray Christ. That's what he's responsible for. And it was partly up to him whether he chose on his own to betray Christ. So he is morally responsible for something. It's just not betraying Christ. Instead, it's something like choosing or deciding on his own to betray Christ. And that's what he's morally responsible for. But it was partly up to him whether he did that, right? Because it was up to him whether he chose on his own. Now, if he hadn't, the neuroscientist would have intervened. But whether the neuroscientist intervenes or not, that's up to Judas. even though Judas doesn't know that, right? Because in most Frankfurt examples, right, we don't know, the agent doesn't know about the neuroscientist that's waiting in the wings, right, to coerce his behavior. But even though he doesn't know, it's up to him whether he chooses on his own. Well, that's not quite right. He doesn't know that it's up to him whether the neuroscientist intervenes, but it is, right? So that's what I would say about that. And I mean, if you want me to, we could talk about why I think we should say that. But that's what I think we should say in response to the Frankfurt cases.
I may leave it there for now, just so we have time to squeeze in the third objection here before we wrap up. But I'd love to have you back on at some point to talk about Frankfurt cases, flicker of freedom. My knowledge kind of ends with your response at like where the dialectic goes from there. So I'd love to hear, well, what does the compatibilist say in response to that? And then the response to the response and the response. I'd love to know what goes on, because that's where my knowledge ends. But
well, we can do that sometime.
Yeah. Okay, why don't we move on to this third core tenet then, divine blame.
Okay.
What's your objection here?
Yeah, so this is something I've been thinking a lot about recently. So divine blame says that God actually does blame us for our sin, and most Calvinists, I think, would say he justly punishes us for our sin. And I think that claim, so this objection actually isn't an objection to that claim. It's an objection to that claim combined with theological determinism, right? And so I think you can't have both theological determinism and divine blame. And I think that even if theological determinism is compatible with responsibility. So suppose God determines everything we do, including our bad behavior. And suppose that's compatible with us deserving blame and punishment for our bad behavior, right? So we'll assume both theological determinism and Calvinism are true. Even so, I don't
mean compatibilism.
Compatibilism. So theological determinism and compatibilism are true. Yes. Even so, I don't think that it would be appropriate or fitting for God to blame or punish us. And so to see how this might work, let's consider a non-theological context, right? So imagine Alice commits adultery on Thursday evening. And right after she does the deed, right, with her lover, she goes over to her sister's house and she finds her brother-in-law in bed with another woman, right? And let's imagine he's blameworthy for his indiscretions, right? He's blameworthy. Even though he's blameworthy, it seems like Alice is in no position to blame him, right, for his indiscretions, given that she just got back, right, from committing her own indiscretions. So he's blameworthy. But as philosophers nowadays would put it, Alice doesn't have the standing to blame her brother-in-law, right? Her blaming him would be hypocritical, given that she just got done doing the same sort of bad thing. Right. So just because someone is blameworthy, it doesn't automatically mean that others have the standing or the right to blame them. So here's a couple of other examples, right? And maybe these involve punishment. If you catch a criminal, right, committing a crime, the criminal might deserve punishment, but it's not your place to punish the criminal, right? That's the state's place. Or if you're at the playground with your kids and, right, you see some other kids off in the distance and maybe, you know, they're little kids and they're behaving badly. Well, if you're not their parent or their guardian or their teacher or something, it's not your place to punish those kids, even if they deserve it, right? So people can be blameworthy and can deserve punishment, but that doesn't necessarily give you the right to blame or punish them. And so I think something similar is true with God on theological determinism. If God is the one that has determined our sin, even if that's compatible with us deserving punishment and blame for our sin, still, given that God is the one that determined us to commit those sins, it seems like he's not entitled to blame or punish us. He doesn't have the standing to blame or punish us, even though maybe we're blameworthy, right? And I think I think that claim in itself has some intuitive pull to it. But here's maybe an example to motivate it more, an argument to motivate it more. Imagine that the mob has kidnapped Jen's kids, and they're threatening to harm the children unless she complies with their demands. And she has no way of rescuing the kids without complying with the mob's demands. So here's what the mob is demanding her to do. It's kind of a silly mob, right? Not a serious mob. They're demanding that she get someone to freely punch her in the face, but without telling the person about her predicament, right? So she's not allowed to say, hey, the mob's got my kids, they're gonna hurt them. If you don't punch me in the face, will you please punch me? No, she can't do that, right? She's got to somehow trick this person into punching her in the face. But Jen is super relieved because she's a practicing psychologist, and she's got this one particular client named George. And George is a great guy. He's an upstanding guy. He's a peace-loving guy. He abhors violence. He thinks that responding to insults with violence is not the right thing to do. But she knows that he's particularly sensitive about his appearance. And she knows that if she insults his appearance in just the right way, he's very likely to explode and punch her in the face, right? So at their next session, she starts in and she insults him in just the right way. And sure enough, even though he knows he shouldn't, he just gets really frustrated and he punches Jen in the face. All right. Now I want you to imagine that after he does this, Jen gets really mad at him and she starts to blame him. And let's say she's filmed the whole thing, right? Because she needs proof for the mob. And after she gets her kids back, she sends the video to the police and prosecutes George for assault. Well, it seems like Jen has behaved really badly in this case, right? She has inappropriately blamed and punished George for assaulting her. Now, it seems that her bad behavior isn't that she set George up to punch her, right? That's not the problem. In doing that, it seems like she acted perfectly permissibly, right? Given that that was the only way she could, protect her kids. Where she went wrong, it seems, is in blaming and punishing George, right, for doing what she set him up to do. And that seems problematic. All right, so if you agree with me about that example, then I think you should agree with me about God blaming and punishing us on theological determinism, because I can't see a relevant difference between the two scenarios. And think about how similar this case is to the God case on theological determinism. Note that Jen doesn't necessarily approve of violence, right? She agrees with George that responding to insults with violence is not the right thing to do. So she doesn't approve of this sort of behavior. She just, in this particular case, she sees it as a necessary evil. Well, similarly, Calvinists and other theological determinists often tell us that, look, God doesn't approve of sin, right? Nevertheless, for some reason, right, reasons presumably beyond our ability to know, right, him determining our sin is a necessary part of his plan. So he doesn't approve of our sin, but it's a necessary evil. Also, we're told that God doesn't act wrongly when he determines us to sin. Yes, the sin is bad, but again, because it's a necessary part of his plan, right? God doesn't act wrongly when he determines us to sin. Well, look, Jen doesn't act wrongly when she sort of sets George up to do this thing. So there are all these similarities between the two cases. So I think that if you agree that Jen has no right to blame George for punching her, or call the police and prosecute him, I think we've got good reason to think that God doesn't have the standing to blame or punish us if he's determined our sinful behavior, right? And this is true even if we are in fact blameworthy and deserving of punishment for that behavior.
Mm-hmm. That's a really intriguing argument. I share the intuitions there. I can't think of a great objection off the top of my head.
Yeah.
What do you think the Calvinist might say?
Yeah. So I want to mention, I can briefly mention two objections that some people have. I don't know if these are, Well, one is definitely not an objection a Calvinist would have, but it's nevertheless objection. So let's start with that one. So some people agree that if theological determinism is true, God doesn't have the standing to blame us. But they think that the explanation for why that is because we're just not responsible if God determines us, right? So they reject compatibilism. They think, right, the reason God doesn't have the standing to blame us is because we're not blameworthy, right? Right? And that's why. But they say if we were blameworthy, then there would be no problem with God blaming us, right? Because he wouldn't be acting wrongly. He wouldn't be endorsing our behavior. It would just be a necessary evil to achieve his providential goals, right? So they agree that God doesn't have the standing to blame on theological determinism, but that's because they reject compatibilism.
But okay, so the Calvinists can appeal to that because
right,
they're
exactly. That one's out for the Calvinists. A different Calvinist objection to this sort of argument is to say that it covertly smuggles in some unwarranted assumptions about the nature of blame. Right. So philosopher John Ross Churchill has argued something like this. He has a really fascinating paper in Faith and Philosophy. I think it's called Determinism and Divine Blame. And he agrees that there's sort of a prima facie or apparent tension here between theological determinism and divine blame. But he thinks it's only apparent. And so what he thinks is going on here is often when we blame one another, right? If you do something unconscionable, right, and I blame you for it, I say, Jordan, how could you, right? How could you do this terrible thing, right? And I sort of ask this question, and it's not quite a rhetorical question, but it's also a question that we know doesn't have an answer, right? When I'm blaming you, if you're really to blame, then there is no answer about how could you, and the only thing you can say is to admit that you were wrong. Now, if God has determined our sin, it does seem inappropriate for God to go, how could you, right? I mean, that just seems insincere, right? God knows how you could, right? Because he set everything up just so you would do it. But Churchill argues, but that's not an essential part of blame. Blame doesn't necessarily involve these demands for explanation. And he thinks that once we see that blame doesn't involve these demands for explanation, we'll see that there's nothing problematic about God blaming us, right? Because God, when he blames us, isn't asking us, right, to account for our behavior. Instead, God is, making judgments about our character, or he's angry with us, or he's releasing his wrath against us for our sinful behavior. So that's, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, what might you say? This we can wrap up after this. What might you say in response to an objection like that?
Yeah. So I think that really just misdiagnoses the problem. So think back to the story about Jen and her patient George, who punches her in the face. It still seems inappropriate for her to blame her, even if she's not like, how could you, right? Maybe she's just really mad at George for punching him in the face, her in the face, right? But it seems like she just doesn't have the right to be mad at him, given that she's the one that set him up, right? So similarly with God, even if when God blames us, God's not like, Justin, how could you do such a thing, right? Even if he's not like that, still, if he's wrathful towards me for something that he, determined that I would do because it fit into his providential plan, he seems just like Jen. So if you think that Jen doesn't have the right to be mad at George for punching her in the face, I would say you should also say that God doesn't have the right to be wrathful towards sinners if he's the one that predetermined their sin, right? So it's not about these demands for explanation that we sometimes give when we blame people. It's about these emotions and these behaviors, right, that we direct towards the people we blame. We're wrathful towards them, and we express that anger towards them. We chew them out, right? We give them the cold shoulder, right? We distance ourselves. It seems like we don't have the right to do that, right, if we're the ones that set the people up.
All right. Well, to sum up, I'll say this, and you can add anything you'd like. You define Calvinism as having at least these three core components: theological determinism, compatibilism, and divine blame. And you gave an argument against each one of these. I won't try to summarize each argument you made, but you gave an argument against each one of these. I'll mention that I've done interviews on at least some of these components. So I've done an interview with Peter Furlong on, well, 2 interviews with Peter Furlong on theological determinism. In one of those interviews, he gives 3 arguments for theological determinism. And then in the other interview, he gives 4 arguments against it. So the viewer might want to check that out. I've done a series of interviews related to compatibilism. The one that I've done that argues for incompatibilism is with Dr. Chris Franklin. So I would point people to that. But I don't think I've really done anything on divine blame. Blame does come up somewhat in the Peter Furlong interviews, but that's an interesting argument. I hadn't heard that one before that you gave. That's really interesting. And I must confess it. I feel the pull of the argument. Do you want to say anything to sum up our discussion, or just give a concluding thought?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you for having me on the show. It's been fun. You know, I like thinking about these things, like talking about them. So it's always good to get a chance to do so.
Well, thank you for coming on again. And thank you all for watching. Check out my playlist on free will and also divine sovereignty and providence. So thanks for watching. Keep exploring Christianity.